It's almost been a year since the launch of the Mi 10T Pro, which featured a 144Hz IPS LCD display. Since then, Xiaomi have released arguably their best devices to date, which include the Mi 11 and Mi 11 Ultra. Now Xiaomi have decided to drop the Mi in their smartphone device naming scheme, and one of the first phones to showcase this has finally been announced, and its name, the Xiaomi 11T Pro. The 11T Pro opts for a 120Hz AMOLED display instead of its predecessor's 144Hz LCD screen, which is a huge step in the right direction for Xiaomi's T-series devices. Not only has it upped the ante in terms of display, but is Xiaomi's first globally released smartphone to pack in 120 watt hypercharge technology, which is a huge bump up from last year's 33 watts seen in the Mi 10T Pro. Xiaomi have also decided to pack in a better 108 megapixel main camera sensor and flagship leading Snapdragon 888 chipset, all while keeping the device at an identical price to the Mi 10T Pro. Starting at just 649 euros, the Xiaomi 11T Pro is $100 cheaper than the vanilla Mi 11 we saw earlier on this year. This is Tech Nick, and this is my full review of the Xiaomi 11T Pro. The 11T Pro comes in 3 different color variants, that being Meteorite Gray, Moonlight White, and Celestial Blue. I have the Meteorite Gray version, and it looks pretty classy. It is nice and shimmery when a light is hitting it, but nice and dark and daunting when it is not in light. Slapping on that case that comes included in the box takes some of the flare away over here, but still is more than decent to use on day one. Peeling that off, getting welcomed back to that fantastic gray looking color, I must say it really is quite a stunner in its own way. We are paired with a 5000 mAh battery, 120 watt Xiaomi Hypercharge. And no, there's no wireless charging, but that 120 watt hypercharge is the key feature of this device. So why not do a full charging speed test right here at the start of the video? As you can see at the bottom left hand corner, we have a wattage meter over there. Was sitting at about 120 watts earlier, now dipped to about 80 watts, probably to keep things a little bit cooler. But 6 minutes and 42 seconds to get to 50% is mental, with 364 milliamp hours per minute, and reaching that 100% mark in just 18 minutes and 7 seconds. Not as quick as the 17 minutes advertised time, but still damn fast. The phone is of course kitted with a Snapdragon 888 CPU, a vapor chamber cooling system, LPDDR5 RAM, UFS 3.1 storage, 5G, Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.2 and NFC. We do have that wonderful Gorilla Glass Victus display protection which we saw on the Mi 11, a Gorilla Glass 5 back, and apparently an aluminum frame. It is 8.8 millimeters thick and just 204 grams in weight. At the back of the device sits a very familiar camera module, and inside that camera module sits an 8 megapixel ultra wide sensor, 108 megapixel ISOCELL HM2 main sensor, and 5 megapixel telemacro lens. The ultra wide sensor takes a more than decent shot, as well as the 108 megapixel main sensor, and as you guys can see, all the streaks going through the screen over here through the actual camera lenses is because there's been a typhoon going non-stop for the last 2 weeks here in Shanghai. So unfortunately, these are the shots you're going to have to deal with. It takes more than decent shots overall, but getting to that 10 times zoom mode doesn't look the best. We also have a clone mode, which looks pretty decent, and the macro mode using the telemacro sensor looks pretty fantastic. Of course, we can also shoot things closer to us than I just showed you using that telemacro sensor, since it can change between 3 to 7 centimeters in distance, and of course using the main 9:1 binned 108 megapixel shot to take portrait shots still does a more than decent job even in gloomy weather. We also have 8K 30 frames per second over here, and because it's sitting at 30 FPS, it means that it's upscaling from 6K, still does a more than decent job, of course, once again on a rainy day over here. 4K 60 FPS, once again, using the main sensor, gyro, electronic image stabilization, keeping things nice and stable over here. 1080p at 60 FPS, 60 FPS across the board over here, looking good, nice, clear and crispy on all things being 8K, 4K and 1080p. And of course, we also have AI video, though it can only be used at 30 FPS. It does indeed pop the colors quite a bit. Ultra wide is capped out at 30 frames per second and 1080p, which is a bit of a bummer, but we can once again use AI video over here, which clearly steps up things in terms of color as well as accuracy in detail. We can do 720p 30 FPS bokeh video mode using the main camera sensor over here. We also have something called magic zoom mode, which does a great job halfway through the shot. And we do have something called Parallel World. I'm not quite sure when I'd use this, but if you are a fan of the Me Film Festival, I'm pretty sure you can do some crazy cool things with this feature. We also have 1080p at 8 frames per second because of slow shutter mode, which is awesome to see on a smartphone. And we have 8K 30 FPS recording at night, which doesn't look the best, but it is at 30 FPS and it is 8K, which should only really be used during the daytime. 4K 60 FPS at night looks worse, but that is because of the frames per second count. The lower the FPS, the better. That is why I showed you the slow shutter speed earlier. So dropping things down to 4K 30 FPS certainly brighten things up, but it does dumb down some of the detail. Same thing with 1080p at 60 FPS over here. Pretty dark at the moment, but dropping things down to 30 frames per second once again brightens everything up, but takes away slightly from the detail, but ever so slightly. AI video is once again here used at night, best used at night since it brightens the shot up quite a bit, and can be used in ultra wide mode too. This is regular mode on ultra wide, and shooting over to the AI mode now, you can sometimes see that it darkens things down, but brings some clarity in terms of color. Taking an ultra wide pic at night with night mode off is not the best. Night mode on, you can definitely see a hell of a lot more. Going into the 12 megapixel bin shot with night mode off, not half bad. Night mode on, way better. 2x digital zoom with night mode off, not too shabby. Night mode on definitely brightens things up, but takes away a lot of the detail. 5x zoom, once again, takes away a hell of a lot of detail, and 10x using night mode off or night mode on is pretty much not an option when taking nighttime photography shots. Moving on to the main sensor and shooting over to the telemacro sensor, even with low light settings, does a pretty decent job. And yes, taking a long exposure mode shot is still pretty darn satisfying. The cameras perform more than decently even in rainy weather. Nevertheless, a fantastic setup at this price point. And on the right hand side, we have the power button as well as the volume rocker, which is unfortunately not split. At the top, we have an infrared blaster, and we do have sound by Harman Kardon over here, powering through the first dual speaker at the top and the second one at the bottom. And yes, Dolby Atmos is packed in too. We have USB 2.0 Type-C ports as well as dual SIM 5G. No option for an SD card here, though there is a water resistant seal. And the selfie camera is 16 megapixels with an aperture of f2.45 and takes some more than decent shots once again in rainy weather over here. Portrait mode also does a fairly decent job with pretty much no edge detection. What's up guys, Technic here, and I'm recording this video on Xiaomi's brand new 11T Pro, and it can record selfie video all the way up to 1080p and 60 frames per second. It has been raining non-stop for the last week here in Shanghai, so I've decided just to take some awesome footage in the rain. And of course, we also have an option for frontal sound, once again, which only picks up audio when using the selfie cam coming from the front and reduces all the noise from the back of the device. We do have 1080p at 60 FPS and recording at night, once again pretty dark, but shooting it down to 30 frames per second brightens it up a lot, like a lot, does a great job when recording using the selfie cam in a nighttime situation. We also have night mode this time around using the selfie camera, which does a more than decent job. Flash mode also works pretty great too, and taking a bokeh portrait looks even better than that. The selfie camera is on par with other smartphones around at this price point, and turning on the device itself, we are of course welcomed to MIUI 12.5. But before we get into that, it is worth mentioning that we do have an arc side fingerprint sensor. It is not an optical reader underneath the display, and when inside the phone, there are a ton of different always on display options that you can choose from. My favorite ones being paired with the super wallpapers that you get, such as the snowy Pics over here, which has a 3-phase animation when locking and unlocking your phone. Looks absolutely fantastic, as we've seen earlier on. We do have 2D facial recognition over here, and just to let you guys know, yes, that theme does change over time. We are welcome to a 6.67 inch AMOLED 20:9 aspect ratio flat dot display. It is full HD plus with 395 pixels per inch. We have more than 1 billion colors on screen, 1000 nits of max brightness, 120 Hz refresh rates, and 480 Hz touch sampling rate. The colors are poppy and extremely vibrant on this very bright screen, that being ranging from 800 typical brightness to 1000 max nits in brightness. And yes, the bezels around the device are pretty symmetrical. Of course, we have that 120 Hz refresh rate. This time around, it is adaptive sync. changing between 60 and 120 Hz. And yes, that 480 Hz touch sampling rate does indeed help when touching your phone, making things feel even more responsive when moving around your screen. Of course, we do have brightness level change over there, reading mode as well, anti-flicker, color scheme over here where you can go crazy in advanced settings as well as change your colors to adapt to the ambient light around the phone, which is great. We have super resolution AI image enhancements, HDR enhancements, and MEMC to up the ante in terms of hertz, pushing things up from 60 Hz to say 120 Hz. And yes, we do have nice deep dark blacks when in dark mode. And of course, we do get into that software department with MIUI 12.5.3 skinned over Android 11 over here. It is nice and clean. I do like it. It is still nice and fluid. It lacks some optimizations, but it is packed with features such as Google. Yes, the Play Store does indeed work. We do have things such as split screen as well as mini window. And I really do like the grid layout when you go into your recent apps, though you can change this and turn it off if you don't prefer that style. The haptics are on point with the likes of the Mi 11 and Mi 11 Ultra with solid tap separation between each tap. We do have dual speakers over here, one at the top, one at the bottom, like I mentioned earlier, with Harman Kardon and Dolby Atmos packed in. But how does it compare against two smartphones which cost quite a bit more? We do of course still have Game Turbo overlay over here, pulling in the little tab from the top left of the screen where you can open up mini tabs as well as set timers. You can also change the visual enhancements of the game that you're running and jump into settings for a couple more other options. You can also go into developer options so that you can toggle on a frame rate monitor over here, which is pretty useful when in game. And we're going to be testing it out here in our first game here being Genshin Impact with the highest possible graphics and maximum frames per second we can get. The game's cap is at 60 frames per second, so even though the phone can go up to 120 FPS, the game is capped at 60 FPS, meaning it can't go higher than that. But that's not really a problem here since the 11T Pro is only hitting a max of 39 FPS, which is still not bad considering that it's not really fluctuating much. Moving on to Bullet Force over here, Ultra Graphics Max FPS, the game's frames per second cap is unlimited and we're getting between 112 and 123 FPS, which is impressive to say the least. Real Racing 3 also doesn't have an FPS cap, but unfortunately the 11T Pro does not have support for the game yet to run at 120 FPS. But what about benchmarks? Well, of course, using that Snapdragon 888 chipset, LPDDR5 RAM and UFS 3.1 storage, we're going to test out the battery percentage as well as the degrees in Celsius at the start of the test. We'll compare this at the end to see how it stacked up throughout the test, as I've done in so many of my reviews before. We just ran through AnTuTu, running through Geekbench, and now moving on to 3D Mark Wildlife. But unfortunately, for some reason, 3D Mark Wildlife failed to run, and I did try this a couple times after this entire test, but I did make sure not to retest it straight after so that we got an accurate battery drain reading. That battery drain reading is 8% drain and 25 milliamp hours per minute, and the temperature only increased by just 8.2 degrees in Celsius. That low addition to temperature certainly explains the low score in AnTuTu version 9 over here, getting just over 700,000 points, which is pretty much 100,000 points behind the average Snapdragon 888 powered smartphone. So it seems like Xiaomi took the approach to maybe slightly dumb down performance, which is not necessarily a bad thing, to keep the phone a lot cooler, which is certainly a good thing in terms of overheating. However, I did still feel like the score was pretty low, so I decided to rerun the test and the results weren't any better. What was better though are the results for Geekbench. The single core score maxed out compared to the average 888 powered smartphone, hitting a score of 1117, which is impressive to say the least, though the multi-core score wasn't quite as good. And as I mentioned earlier, 3D Mark Wildlife failed to run. I did try it again and again, again, but unfortunately I couldn't get it to work. The Xiaomi 11T Pro may have a very simplistic design, but thanks to that meteorite grey colored backplate, certainly stands out when compared to other Mi 11 devices. It may have a very familiar looking camera module, but inside that bump sits a very beastly 108 megapixel sensor, which has been upgraded to an ISOCELL HM2 sensor, which takes phenomenal photos and videos. The device is kitted with a side-mounted fingerprint sensor, much like we saw on its predecessor, and while it does not sit under the display, still gets you into your home screen ridiculously fast. Once sitting in the home screen, you are welcomed to Xiaomi's MIUI 12.5 skinned over Android 11, which is clean and simple to use, but I would have liked to have seen a refreshed MIUI 13 this time round. The 11T Pro is stacked with incredible hardware such as a Snapdragon 888 CPU, LPDDR5 RAM, and UFS 3.1 storage, and when paired with the adaptive sync 120Hz refresh rate, as well as a 480Hz touch sampling rate, games like an absolute champion. And let's not forget about that color-popping 6.67-inch AMOLED display, which packs in more than 1 billion colors and brightens up to a crazy 1000 nits. The 11T Pro of course also packs in 120 watt hypercharge, which can charge your phone full up in less than 20 minutes and should last all day thanks to that massive 5000 mAh battery, making it a true battery king. Which leads me to say that I am more than happy to recommend the Xiaomi 11T Pro not only to those on a budget, but to anyone who wants one of the best phones in terms of battery, alongside some of the most impressive specifications ever seen in a smartphone.